Hello and welcome to Pacific Power. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. There are fears a new pact between Beijing and the Solomon Islands could undermine security in the South Pacific and potentially give China the ability to build a military base in our backyard. Coming up, we investigate how the deal sent shockwaves across the oceans and get reaction from Canberra, Beijing, Port Moresby and Honiara, plus expert analysis on the shifting geopolitical situation. Australia is still working out how to respond to an increasingly crowded Pacific while keeping regional tensions in check. But the US and Western allies are worried it could become a theatre of conflict and undermine our relationship with our neighbours.
China's influence in the South Pacific has grown rapidly in the last decade. More countries in the region are forming alliances and signing development and aid deals with Beijing. Now a possible security agreement between China and Solomon Islands has some countries, especially Australia, worried.
The security pact between China and Solomon Islands ringing alarm bells.
An emerging threat on our nation's doorstep.
What is the real big worry here?
How concerned should we be?
It is a cause of great concern, as some foreign policy watchers have described it. It's Australia's greatest nightmare.
So what's got Australia and its allies so alarmed about China's alliance with Solomon Islands? Recently, leaked documents showed a new security agreement could see Chinese personnel and equipment stationed in the country, which lies about 2,000 kilometres northeast of Australia.
That is our backyard, that is our neighbourhood, and we are very concerned of any activity that is taking place in the Pacific Islands.
And a reminder of the constant pressure and threats that present in our region to our own national security.
We do not want to see the militarisation of the Pacific.
But why does Australia see China having a military presence in the region as concerning? Essentially, it's about world order. China has emerged as the great rival of Australia's traditional strategic ally, the US. But Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare said the backlash to his country's security agreement with China was insulting, and there were no plans to ask Beijing to build a military base in the country.
We find it very insulting, Mr. Speaker, to be branded as unfit to manage our sovereign affairs or have other motives in pursuing our national interests.
In recent years, Solomon Islands, like many countries in the South Pacific, has been seeking closer ties to China. In 2019, Solomon Islands struck a new diplomatic deal with Beijing and ended its 36-year relationship with Taiwan. When Honiara announced the deal, Taipei responded by closing its embassy and flying its staff out of the country. You might wonder why a country like Solomon Islands can't have diplomatic ties with both China and Taiwan. This is because of long-standing tensions between the two. Essentially, China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually need to be reunified, while Taiwan sees itself as a democracy. Taiwan has worked hard to create alliances in the Pacific, but China has been winning over many of Taiwan's allies and encouraging them to adopt the One China policy. Countries who acknowledge the policy do not have an official diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. The Pacific has traditionally been a stronghold for Taiwan, but with Solomon Islands and Kiribati switching ties in 2019, only 4 countries in the region, Marshall Islands, Nauru, Tuvalu and Palau, still maintain diplomatic ties to Taiwan. Many see increased financial aid as key to what China is offering Solomon Islands. When Solomon Islands switched allegiance to China, some US $500 million was reportedly promised by Beijing. This was a lot more than Taiwan promised. Between 2011 and 2017, Taipei reportedly spent US $105 million in the Solomons. At the time, China said it could offer the country unrivaled opportunities.
We're convinced that the establishment and development of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, the world's second largest economy with more than 1.4 billion people and a bright future, will surely bring unprecedented development opportunities for the Solomon Islands.
This deal is one of many examples of what's known as China's Belt and Road Initiative, a global development strategy to create trade routes and increase Chinese influence around the world. But back in Solomon Islands, not everyone has been happy about Beijing's growing influence. Last year, violent protests broke out in the capital Honiara, and they were in part linked to foreign policy. Many local Chinese-owned businesses were targeted in the protests.
The deepening rift between Malata and the central government has been spurred on by accusations the government isn't doing enough to develop their region, and by the government's 2019 decision to end relations with Taiwan and switch to China.
To help quell the violence, Australia sent troops and police officers to Solomon Islands. Prime Minister Sogavare requested the assistance as part of the existing security agreement between Canberra and Honiara. China has also sent police to Solomon Islands to train local officers, a move Australian officials are watching closely. Tensions on the streets of Honiara have calmed, and Solomon Islands Prime Minister continues to defend the alliance with China.
The fact that some people believe that there are countries, that small independent and sovereign states like Solomon Islands should not extend their diplomatic relations to include security arrangements, because that is a threat to the national security while they enjoy such relationship. We find that very, very difficult to swallow.
If the Pacific nation goes ahead with the planned security deal, any next move by Australia will likely be aimed at countering China's influence in the region.
Australia's Minister for the Pacific, Zed Seseldra, doesn't want an authoritarian regime in the Pacific's security environment. And he joins me now. Senator, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Jeremy.
How concerned are you, or how suspicious are you, that there's more than meets the eye with China's intentions in the South Pacific?
Well, it is concerning, and obviously we've seen, I guess, a fairly aggressive posture from China in the region in recent times. We've seen that in South China Sea, and so obviously we want to see peace and prosperity here in Australia and indeed in our region. And so as we've engaged with the region, as we've engaged with China, that has been the message that we've had. We obviously are still willing to continue dialogue with China. That hasn't been where we would like it to be in recent times, and we're all aware of some of the reasons for that. But fundamentally, when we look to the Pacific, we look for their prosperity as well as the peace and prosperity and security of Australia and the region.
The thing is, China's growing influence in the region is not unforeseen. So does this amount to a diplomatic failure by Australia?
Well, no. I mean, in the end, sovereign nations will make sovereign decisions, but we have been engaging very, very strongly with the region, including the Solomon Islands. We have stepped up our engagement when it comes to whether it's our aid budget, whether it's our people-to-people links, whether it is our security links, and in the Solomon Islands in particular. We have demonstrated just in the last few months just what a reliable partner we are. When the Solomon Islands was facing difficulties with riots and unrest, it was Australia they turned to first, and within 24 hours of that request, we had our AFP and ADF on the ground. They remain there, and I would say even in the context of this discussion around this draft agreement between the Solomon Islands and the People's Republic of China, we have heard messages from the Solomon Islands government making it very clear that Australia remains the partner of choice. Now, that does not mean that we don't have ongoing and remaining concerns, and we are raising those concerns about this security agreement. But in terms of the level of our effort, in terms of the way we have stepped up, the way we respond to disasters, to unrest or other issues in the region, we are the partner of choice, and I think that is for good reason.
And despite that, this is where we find ourselves. That's got to amount of failure at some level, doesn't it?
Well, look, you know, there will be those who will try and claim that is the case. But when it comes to some of our political opponents in Australia who have said that, the Labor Party, they've said it's because of climate change. That is a complete misreading of the situation. They've said falsely that we've cut aid to the region. That is not the case. So, you know, those critics would have to say what exactly should have been done differently. So all of the efforts are there. They are continuing, even in the midst of these discussions. The Solomon Islands government have made it very clear that Australia remains the security partner of choice. We've made that clear. We raise these concerns. We raise them respectfully. We're working with our partners in the region as well, and I think many of those concerns are shared in the region, and of course there is a long way to go in these discussions.
Are you taking this as a strategic wake-up call by Manasseh Sogavare?
Well, I mean, people can describe it however they would like. What I would say is we've been aware of the geostrategic competition in the region for some time. Our efforts in the Pacific predate any of that, but of course they have stepped up considerably in recent years. And if you look at what we are doing right now in the region, it's delivering Guardian-class patrol boats, whether it is building the western border outpost in the Solomons. We've agreed with the eastern border outpost. The efforts that are there from our aid budget, from our people-to-people links to our military cooperation and our security cooperation, it is at the highest level that it has ever been. Now, that's not to say that there aren't challenges. Of course there are, and we're aware of those. But for some of those domestic critics, I would say, they haven't in any way indicated what they would do differently except to falsely claim cuts where there haven't been cuts, or to claim that somehow a country like Australia, which has reduced its emissions twice as fast as the average of the OECD, that somehow closer engagement between the Solomon Islands and China, who have seen their emissions going up rapidly, that somehow climate change is to blame, I think is just a complete false diagnosis of the issue.
How conceivable is it to you that this whole episode, all these developments, have brought forward the prospect of armed conflict on Australia's doorstep in the Pacific?
Well, I wouldn't be making those kind of assertions at all. We are concerned, but I think we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. The Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands has made it very, very clear there are no bases here. As I say, that doesn't take away our concerns about the possibility of this agreement and what it might mean, and that's why we're making very strong representations in relation to it. But I wouldn't sort of draw those kind of conclusions. All I would say is we live in challenging geostrategic times. It's one of the reasons we've invested so much in our defence capability. It is one of the reasons, though not the only reason, why we've seen such a stepped up effort in our region by the Australian government, and we are seeing significant degrees of success in that, whether it is in our response to COVID and being the partner of choice in delivering doses right across our region, or whether it is in our security arrangements, whether it is supporting humanitarian efforts in response to natural disasters, whether it is our climate financing. Our efforts have stepped up in every area, but certainly it is a challenging geostrategic environment. And it's, as I say, it's one of the reasons we invest more and more in our defence capability, but also use all of the arms of government to make sure that we are investing in the peace and prosperity of our region.
There is also concurrent speculation about American troops eventually being stationed at a new port to be built in Darwin Harbour. What would you say the prospects of that are?
Well, obviously that's a matter for the Defence Minister and others to comment on in detail, but I would say this: what we have seen in recent times is the cooperation with our alliance partner, the United States, has been very, very good. I think that is in our national interest. We, as a government, have taken that relationship to a new level through AUKUS. This is something that no government has been able to achieve in decades. It is the most significant agreement since ANZUS. So the level of our cooperation between Australia and the United States and our other allies is at the highest level it's ever been, certainly since World War II and when we've been involved in serious conflicts in the past. But in peacetime, to have this kind of level of engagement, whether it's AUKUS, which is very significant, and indeed in other fora such as the Quad, we are stepping up with our partners, and that is very, very important. And I think that is being seen, and not just here in our region, but it's being seen around the world in terms of the kind of leadership that Scott Morrison has showed in landing those agreements.
Would you say, though, that these developments have undermined the very premise of that AUKUS pact?
No. Sorry, which developments are you referring to?
Well, these developments between, this draft agreement between the Solomon Islands and China, this growing influence that we're seeing on a number of fronts of China in the Pacific, would you say that's undermined the AUKUS Pact's mission to provide a free and open South Pacific region?
No, not at all. I think it just highlights some of the challenges we're facing. I don't think anyone should be naive enough to think that there aren't these challenges, that there aren't efforts by the Chinese government in the region. That has been apparent for many years. They are obviously a very significant power. They are a nation we have a positive trading relationship with, but of course we have a challenging relationship with at the moment, and that's been well documented. But if anything, these kind of efforts simply highlight the need to be leaving no stone unturned, whether it is our direct engagement in the Pacific, whether it is our partnerships such as AUKUS, which do bring increased security for Australia through that kind of cooperation, or indeed whether it is our other multilateral engagements such as the Quad. I think this would simply highlight the need to leave no stone unturned, and that's what the Australian government's been doing.
Do you think the Solomons can still be won over at this stage?
Well, discussions continue to take place, and what I would say is that when I've reached out to counterparts and colleagues in the region, they share many of the concerns that have been expressed by Australia and by New Zealand and others, and many of those discussions are taking place, and we are engaging very closely with the region. So one of the things I'll be doing this weekend is a number of leaders, a number of senior representatives from Pacific Island nations will be coming into Australia. We'll be in Brisbane, and we'll be having discussions around many issues, but including some of these shared concerns.
Senator Zed Seselja, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let's bring in Rick Ho. He's a former Prime Minister, Finance Minister and Central Bank Governor of the Solomon Islands. He joins me now from the capital, Honiara. Rick Ho, thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you, there's a lot of speculation at this stage. How certain are you that this draft agreement between China and the Solomon Islands will in fact result in a Chinese military presence in the Solomon Islands?
Well, at the moment it's not very clear, but I have to confess I don't know I don't have the details of this agreement. But the Prime Minister has announced in Parliament that it's now ready to be signed. It probably has been signed. But I think this is just another further sort of demonstration of the problems that the current government is causing in terms of controversial issues that has been coming from since 2019, and this agreement certainly has not gone down well with the population here.
How are people responding there? How do they feel about the opportunities or the risks presented by this geopolitical contest taking place in their homeland?
People are very concerned. There's a general concerns that have been raised by the community leaders all throughout this country. And I think it's sort of coming from in 2019 when Solomon Islands severed its relations with the ROC and taking on its diplomatic ties with China. It seems that the government continues to develop these engagements at a very fast rate, and this is causing a lot of concern and tensions among people here, and especially towards the government and the Prime Minister.
And so why is the Prime Minister following with this pace of developing this relationship with Solomon Islands when there is unease about it at home? Is this about setting off a bidding war between the different parties that are concerned?
Well, I don't know, but the people who know the Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, would agree with me that he's someone who has almost like thrives on controversies, and in recent years, that's his sort of like his a hallmark of his leadership. I think there is a reason to believe that given his the way he sort of conducts himself and also government actions, there is a lot of people in Solomon Islands that believe this is self-preservation, and I think he obviously is confusing his personal security with that of national security. And many of us in Solomon Islands believe that Sogobaret thinks no one else except China can fill this gap, as it were, to ensure that his security is secured. I think he's about self-preservation in his current leadership.
Let me ask you about that self-preservation, that idea, because Daniel Suidani, who's the Premier of Malaita province, where those riots took place late last year, says Australia should not have intervened when Manasseh Sogavare called for help because it's seen as keeping a corrupt Prime Minister in power. Those were his words. What should have Australia have done when that call for help was made?
No, I think personally, I think it's a good sort of decision that Australia made, because that is also sort of a part of the what is left of Ramsey, and Australia was only responding as in terms of that agreement, and I think it's an important agreement for Solomon Islands to continue with.
But it also helps the preservation of this leader who is controversial in Solomon Islands, doesn't it?
I think what we need to deal with here in Solomon Islands is to deal with him as a political sort of how should I say it, as in politics. And I think what I'm thinking about is that it's really the electoral system here that places him where he is now. And the electoral system is such that he can manipulate for his own sort of liking. And he uses money from his foreign friends and local friends to do that. So I think the action that Australia responded to come and settle peace here and to ensure that the security situation is restored, for me, I think it's a good. It's important that Australia responded in that way.
Rick Ho, it's terrific to have you on the program. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
So let's get reaction now from inside China. Chen Hong is the director of the Australian Studies Centre at the East China Normal University in Shanghai. Chen Hong, welcome to the program.
Hello, good evening.
How legitimate is the speculation and anxiety you're seeing playing out in Australia right now about China's intentions in the South Pacific?
Well, I think actually the agreement is a security cooperation agreement. It is not a defense cooperation agreement. So actually, there's a lot of far-fetched congestions. Just thinking about a kind of like military cooperation, about China setting up a military base in Honiara in the Solomon Islands. But definitely, this is not the case actually, because definitely it is only security cooperation agreement. Mind you that this is actually in response to the social unrest in the last year, with a lot of Chinese businesses, Chinese homes and shops being attacked by rioters. So actually the Solomon Islands government, intend to cooperate with Chinese police force. Mind you, actually this is very normal. For example, like the Chinese police, force, used to have cooperation agreements with Italy. Chinese police, were patrolling in Rome, and Italian police were patrolling in Beijing, in Shanghai. Because actually there are a lot of Italian tourists here, a lot of Chinese tourists over in Italy. So this is actually a kind of police cooperation, not a kind of like a military, alliance.
So you're saying China has no military ambitions in Solomon Islands whatsoever?
Well, I think actually both the Chinese Foreign Minister, Chinese Foreign Ministry, and also the Solomon Islands, Prime Minister, both denied that actually there's any military connotation in the in the agreements. So actually, in other words, both China and the Solomon Islands denied actually there's any military connotation in the agreement, in the cooperation. But other countries such as Australia or some other countries were actually thinking about as if they were wishing there could be a military cooperation, but that's definitely not the case.
Wishing for a military conflict, do you think? Or wishing for military cooperation, do you think?
No, I mean, for example, Australia has always been talking about China having this military, thinking, or planning, in the Solomon Islands, but that's definitely not the case, because both the countries, denied about this possibility.
Well, there is that deal that China's recently done with Cambodia that's raised concerns in that region. There is China's conduct in the South China Sea and its dealings with other Southeast Asian nations. This is not unprecedented.
Well, I think actually different areas and different regions have different scenarios. For example, like South China Sea, this is a Chinese internal domestic matter. In Cambodia, that's definitely another story. So actually, you should not simply to be thinking about a story and impose it on another area. That's definitely not the logical way of thinking about geopolitics.
I don't know if you've seen that leaked draft of the pact between China and the Solomon Islands. The terms of it seem pretty broad, and the analysis is that it leaves the door fairly open for China to escalate the nature of that relationship, so Chinese forces could be used to protect Chinese personnel, Chinese projects in Solomon Islands. What Chinese forces even means is very, very unclear. The entry of personnel, weapons, intelligence and judicial immunity would be granted, and that neither party could disclose information about that agreement, that cooperation, without mutual consent. I mean, that sounds very broad, and this is where some of the suspicion comes from. What do you think of that?
Well, that's why I think actually we should not be making conjectures about the cooperation, because between two sovereign countries, China and the Solomon Islands, we do have common grounds, and also we do have common concerns, and there are a lot of areas we can cooperate. But definitely, as I said, this is a security. By security, we mean this a kind of to ensure social stability. This is not about defense or military cooperation. So that actually sets a tone to this agreement.
Is the South Pacific strategically important for China?
Well, I think actually, strategically, China don't have, military ambitions, anywhere in the world. China is a very, defensive, has a defensive, defense policy. China don't want to pursue any, geopolitical ambitions elsewhere in the world. Mind you, actually, China doesn't have any military force outside, its vicinity. It is, for example, like the United States, who has, so many, military bases all over, the world. Mind you, of course, we are showing the military parade of the Chinese during the Chinese, National Day parades again, but this is not about Chinese military expansionism. This is actually in celebration of the Chinese National Day. That is actually a kind of, celebration. This is not a kind of like show of force or muscle flexing. So in other words, always, I think, in Australian, television, you always see, this kind of, showing a kind of muscle flexing China, but that's not China.
One of the discussions being had in Australia and around the region right now is the prospect of defence troops being based at a new port in the harbour of Darwin, and that eventually American troops could be based there as well. Would that change the calculation for China about what happens in this region?
Well, it is the United States that has, 2,500 military troops in Darwin. China doesn't have any military, presence, in the South Pacific. That is a fact. So in other words, it is, for example, like China doesn't have any, military projection, deployments, in the South Pacific. So this is definitely not some kind of thing to be concerned about. So in other words, it is always kind of like an over speculation about China's intention, but this is definitely not what, people should be thinking in a logical way.
Dr. Chen Hong, it's terrific to have your analysis on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So, as we've heard, for Solomon Islanders, the geopolitical contest between some of the region's most prominent powers is being felt very close to home. Their government will be critical to what happens next, and it's not lost on many that Solomon Islands is now negotiating a comprehensive and broadly worded security agreement with China, a country it only recognised diplomatically in 2019. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts.
Honiara is a small city, but right now it's the scene of a subterranean battle in great power politics.
To Australia, who is the big brother in the Pacific, and like for us, Solomon Island, we've been depending on Australia and New Zealand for almost of our years.
My concern is that security agreement has direct impact to the sovereignty of this country.
The streets still bear the scars of last year's riots when the capital exploded in violence, partly fuelled by political tension stoked by the government's decision to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China. Australia sent in police to restore order, but Solomon Islands has also turned to its new friend for help with training its forces. And 12 days ago, Solomon Islands was catapulted into global headlines when a broadly worded draft security agreement with China was leaked.
What's disturbing about this text, which appears to me as if it was essentially drafted in Beijing, is that it provides something of a blank cheque to China to have a forced presence in the Solomon Islands.
Australian officials are aghast. They believe the pact could even be a first step towards a Chinese military base in the country. And there's also disquiet in Solomon Islands, where civil society is raising the alarm.
This treaty is no more than selling the sovereignty of Solomon Island as if it is a commodity.
Beijing denies there's any plan for a Chinese military base in Solomon Islands. It insists it's purely focused on aid, development and police cooperation, and has accused Australia of paranoia.
The relevant parties should see the China-Solomon Islands security cooperation objectively and rationally and stop making irresponsible remarks.
But that's not been enough to quell concerns inside Solomon Islands, where the secrecy surrounding the deal is causing frustration.
The least that it could do is to consult people about this agreement, to get people's view on it, and to explain to the people what it is all about.
while the prospect of Chinese police or even soldiers in the country has stirred uncertainty.
We know that there are issues in China in relation to freedoms, and if these forces are in the country, will the current freedoms that we do enjoy now, will they continue or not?
Australia's lobbying other Pacific nations to press Solomon Islands to dilute or ditch the pact. Some Pacific leaders have picked up the phone and expressed concerns to Solomon's Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare, but in public they're treading carefully.
The Prime Minister did indicate to me in our meeting that he's not done something extraordinary. There's no military base relocated or something like this.
While in Canberra, strategists are already turning their minds to what will happen if China does get a toehold in Solomon Islands.
So this is a game changer for our strategic environment, because it means that there would be essentially permanently an armed presence of a potentially hostile great power in our neighbourhood, off our eastern seaboard.
Australia faces a wicked conundrum in Solomon Islands. It retains immense influence in the country. It's by far the largest aid donor and has been instrumental to its COVID-19 vaccine rollout. It's also still got several dozen Australian personnel in the country helping keep the peace after last year's riots. But if Australia tries to use that leverage to try and force Solomon Islands to ditch this security pact, it risks poisoning the relationship and driving the Pacific Island country even closer to China. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Canberra.
At a time when China's trying to exert its influence in the Pacific, one of its projects in Papua New Guinea has run into some embarrassing hurdles. A Chinese-owned state company has spent $95 million building the country's tallest building, but it's sitting empty in Port Moresby because regulators say it's riddled with building defects. PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting has this story.
One building rises above the others on Port Moresby's skyline. The Noble Centre, built by a Chinese state-owned company, is PNG's tallest building, but it sits empty.
It's a lot of wrong things. I've seen some reports. And that's why I took the occupancy certificate back. Just wasn't safe.
Documents obtained by the ABC list 75 defects, including electrical and fire safety issues. Some are described as highly illegal and dangerous. The company earlier went to court to try to stop news coverage of this building report. The defects at the Noble Centre were uncovered by PNG Ports, which owns the land and agreed to buy the top 2 floors.
Wherever there's a weakness of governance, you will get these types of projects or these types of problems you have with property development, where the regulatory oversight isn't strong enough.
In 2018, as world leaders descended on Port Moresby for APEC, the Noble Centre was touted as a sign of China's growing influence. Concerns have also been raised about the quality of a convention centre donated at the time.
PNG needs to be really careful and selective, and not just going for whoever puts their hand up first and says, "Oh, we'll fund you for this."
The geopolitical jostle in the Pacific means several countries are vying to invest and give aid here. Australia is also ramping up its presence, including giving direct budget support to the PNG government, which it hadn't done for almost 2 decades.
In a way, yes, they're responding so as to be able to be seen to have that level of influence and to be able to outcompete with each other to some extent. But it's not necessarily in PNG's best interest.
The Noble Centre has now been put into receivership. The company behind it says it's trying to reach some understanding of how to proceed with PNG Ports. The Chinese embassy says cooperation between the two countries has brought tangible benefits to both, and this is a matter between two companies. It's unclear what, if any, remedial work has been done since the building faults were identified. Natalie Whiting, ABC News, Port Moresby.
I now want to call on Natasha Kassam. She's the Director of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy at the Lowy Institute, specialising in Indo-Pacific strategy. She joins us now. Natasha Kassam, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy.
Is this a diplomatic failure for Australia? Why was this missed?
Look, we're getting a lot of different stories about why or if this was missed, how much exactly Australia knew. What I would say is that this draft security agreement is a symptom, not the cause of some kind of issue here. China's global reach has been expanding for some time. It's been looking for various ways to support the People's Liberation Army as it grows a world-class military power. And with that, it has foreshadowed for some time, I mean, as early as 2004, under the previous leader in China, that it would be looking to have these historic missions overseas. So I think these growing security agreements, seeing more evidence of this kind of cooperation, whether it's in Solomon Islands or Cambodia, or their existing Chinese base in Djibouti, I think we're going to see more of this as China continues to pursue its ambitions.
We heard Chen Hong a moment ago tell us that those situations, these different regions, are not comparable. What do you make of that statement?
I mean, a lot of people would ask the question as to why Solomon Islands, why that particular part of the South Pacific. But again, I would argue that it is a small piece of this broader strategy where China wants to exert influence in a whole range of issues. I don't think it's fair to say that a potential base isn't comparable with respect to Chen Hong, but I would also just point to what Solomon Islands leaders and others have already said, which is that they have no intention of hosting a Chinese base at this stage.
We heard from Rick Ho, the former Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, earlier as well. He seems to think that this deal may have already been signed. Is that credible?
I mean, he would know better than I would say. But I do think that we saw this quite frenzied debate after the draft agreement was linked. You saw several voices in Western media in particular, calling for pretty wild speculation about what this meant, really undermining Solomon Islands sovereignty. And I think in those circumstances, you can see why the Prime Minister, Sogavare, has come out and said they've initialed the deal. If anything, I think the way in which the issue was discussed did put his back against a wall, and I do think we need to think more carefully about how a lot of different voices want to be a part of this debate to try to encourage the outcomes that Australia is looking for. We saw some people saying that Australia should invade Solomon Islands, like completely wild speculation.
What is at stake for Australia if this military base, this Chinese military base, were to be built?
So again, I am sceptical of such a thing, but I think it would be very concerning for Australia. I don't buy into the argument that it would, cut off trade routes or cause issues for supply chains. There's a lot of ocean around Australia. That would require a tremendous projection of power that I don't anticipate. But I think Australia would see it as maybe a listening post, an option for surveillance, and a general kind of thorn in the side that they would really rather avoid. It would also demonstrate that Australia was not only the first and primary security partner of choice in the Pacific, which it has prided itself on for decades. And so to lose that mantle, which I don't think is yet lost, but if that were to happen, I think that would be quite a blow in terms of Australia's ambitions for the Indo-Pacific and its view of its role in our region.
The commander of the US Pacific Fleet says there is still a path ahead. What does that path look like, and how much influence does Australia retain in all of this?
Australia still has a significant amount of influence in Solomon Islands and in a range of other Pacific islands, right? It's still playing such an important role, as we heard Stephen Jejix and others talk about previously. I don't think that that is lost. I don't think that that influence counts for nothing. But the path forward, in my view, has to be a positive vision. It has to be what is Australia doing to plug the gaps that Solomon Islands has identified in its security? What is Australia doing in the face of these kinds of issues of domestic turmoil? And of course, most importantly, what is Australia doing to respond to our neighbours' concerns about our climate change policy, which they consistently identify as their number one concern when it comes to Australia?
How much does it come down to money? I mean, to what degree can Australia keep up with that competition, particularly fiscally, from China?
I think money is a big part of it, and that is a really big challenge when you have so many different companies operating with quite impressive levels of funding. But again, it's about offering a positive vision. It's about saying our infrastructure might be slower, we might have to jump through more hoops, there might be more bureaucracy, but at the end, you're not going to have an empty tower in Port Moresby, right? I think that it's really important to demonstrate that we think working through more transparent systems will build confidence, will lead to business confidence, and will also end up with projects that are ultimately needed. But of course, this is a matter for these governments. It is a matter of their agency, what they want to be built and what they want to be invested in. And it's really important that Australia, China, anybody else that looks to be a donor or partner in the region is listening.
All right, Natasha Kassam, it's terrific to have you on the program. Thank you so much for your analysis. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the program, Pacific Power. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Thanks for your company. You'll find more on ABC iView and ABC News Online. From us, bye for now.